This podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's new Patreon community, the Global Coffee Think Tank. Check the show notes or head to patreon.com/Mapper Forward to find out how you can become a member today. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and we are talking with Todd McCarthy about how the coffee industry has changed over the last decade or 2 decades. And in the last episode, we talked about what the most significant challenges that cafe owners have as we approach very interesting times. Interesting being, you know, all the weird fuckery that's going on with the economy and food chain, food supply and all that kind of stuff. Today, we're going to talk, Todd, about how that is for coffee roasters, because you have a coffee roasting business as well as managing cafes, owning cafes. So what are the challenges ahead for coffee roasters?
Oh, that's it's the tip of the iceberg, really. But I've been fortunate enough to see the progression to where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, Arabica Excelso has just seen immense inflation rates. I was talking just earlier with a good friend of mine who is a grain trader, importer, exporter, and he was talking about what I like to consider as being the golden years. We're talking sort of 2016, 2017. And they really were. I mean, coffee was at a really reasonable price. Everything was nice and stable, and the whole thing was just working really well.
For who? Can I get some clarity on that? Was it working well for roasters or for producers?
I'd say more roasters than producers.
Okay.
But I mean, for instance, we've got in that time period, 2016, 2017, coffees that were scoring, say, 86.5 on a cupping table.
Mm-hmm.
They were coffees that were either single producer lots, or they were regional producer groups that were contributing to an ICO or a specific lot. These coffees are now in 2022. They're almost unaffordable. And especially for, I mean, I'm sure that I'm not quite sure of the figures exactly, but I'm sure there's much more smaller roasting groups in Australia that are either looking after themselves or a very small wholesale network than what there are larger roasting companies. And more interestingly, the entry-level coffees that are scoring sort of 82, 83 are now going for the same price as what the 86.5 plus coffees were in 2016, 2017.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that just gives some indication of inflation, geopolitical influence, and all of these things are just having such an immense effect on the coffee supply chain at the end of the day.
People are saying that, don't worry, this is all going to correct itself. I wish people that were listening could see your face.
Yeah. And I really wish that was the case. But I mean, green coffee, the people who trade in green coffee, they had some sort of foresight in sort of Q2, Q3 of last year, where they were like, okay, well, something's going on. Mm-hmm. There is going to be a huge pitch in price. And I mean, we all saw what happened in Brazil last year with all of the terrible frost that they had. And that's just had a trickle-on effect across all producing nations. I mean, hypothetically, if you see a low-pressure system come into Brazil, you see a spike in volatility.
On the sea market immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
Immediately.
And I mean, that's the environment that we're now working in.
So for anyone who doesn't, who isn't quite familiar with the sea market, what Todd meant there was that because coffee is traded on a futures market, which means, to put it very simply. And this is for commercial grade coffee, not for specialty grade coffee, but it does influence the specialty market because it takes its lead from the commercial market and adds extra derivatives on top, so differentials on top. So what happens is people go and they bid to buy coffee on this futures market to take receipt of it at a future date. And so what happens is brokers who are facilitating the exchanges of these contracts where people are bidding for these things, they look at what's happening around the world in coffee producing countries and they feed that information to the market. And the market turns around and says, well, because of this frost that has happened in Brazil, I think that means that eventually there's going to be a drop in yield in the coffee that's in Brazil. And so therefore, if there's a drop in supply, there's going to be an increase in demand, which means the price is going to go up. This is the basics of inflation. And so anytime, and what Todd was saying there is the moment there's a cold front coming in now into Brazil, and it happened just a couple of months ago, that everyone was freaking out about this potential cold front that was coming into Paraná, and I'm sure I said that wrong, but it's a similar region to what it was last year. The market spiked in a big way just over the potential of
Absolutely.
a weather system affecting the yields for next year. And because of people understanding that inflation is already here, that compounds on top of people's concerns about the increase of fertilizer and the increase of nitrogen and other inputs that go into creating coffee. So we are in a very unique scenario right now, wouldn't you say, Todd? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Coffee industry has never been like this.
No. And I strongly believe that in a few years' time, that we're going to look back on this period and we're going to study it. And
I agree.
We're going to really, really pick it apart and just figure out, okay, well, sure, all of these things happened in such a short amount of time. All these really crazy things have been going on. And we will absolutely learn from it. But yeah, I think there's going to be a serious amount of study go into it by many people across many sectors.
I think I definitely agree with that. They'll make movies like The Big Short about this moment in time, because this is unprecedented what we're going through right now, and we're not anywhere near the end of it, because right now the conversation is on inflation but quickly shifting to deflation. And so people are worried that there's going to be, have you heard of the bullwhip effect?
No, I haven't.
So when if you imagine a bullwhip, like a whip that people use to, whip and snap, like the long things, what happens is at the beginning of the end where the person who's using the whip is holding it, the wave is quite small from the time that they put the whip up to the time they go to snap it. So the wave is quite small, but as it gets further out, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So the bullwhip effect is used to explain this with regards to supply chains. And what the idea is that when we end up in times like this, and it happened during the pandemic as well, where supply chains were constrained, every stakeholder in the supply chain realizes that we haven't forecast enough. And so what they do is everybody overcompensates.
Yes.
And so therefore inventory levels get larger and larger and larger as you get closer to the consumer. And so what you've got, and they call this the bullwhip effect. So from the coffee producer is the person who has the most constrained amount of coffee. And as you get further to the exporter and the importer and then the green distributor and then the coffee roaster, what you find is at every step, they are overcompensating for the issues with supply.
Absolutely.
Which leads to something that's called deflation, which is the opposite of inflation. And what you'll have is, because of inflation, there's going to be what's called demand destruction. And so people just decide, you know what, fuck it, I'll go without. So the demand that used to exist before will just go away, like what we're seeing with gasoline, petrol right now. You know, people are saying, well, I'm just not going to go on that extra holiday where I'm going to drive for the weekend, or I'm going to take public transport to work rather than drive my car to work. So that's demand destruction. And so this bullwhip effect is going to mean, if it's something that really is existing in the coffee industry, which I suspect it is, that at the consuming end, roasters are going to have more stock than what they need if they can afford to carry it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Which will mean that in order for them to get rid of their stock, they have to start reducing prices. So this is where economists are suspecting and hypothesizing that inflation will be here for a minute, and then we could transition to a deflationary period based on the particular commodity that we're talking about and how long the lack of supply lasts. And I think if we do look at what's so challenging about this time for roasters, I think the uncertainty is the biggest challenge moving forward.
That's why gathering green coffee in any which way that they can, just to ensure a small amount of consistency in their products. But I mean, is that the same scenario that I don't know too much about it, but did they burn a whole lot of coffee in Brazil one year, many years ago?
Yeah, and that was at the producing end, right? So what they did there was, and it's historically something that's done with a lot of commodities. So what they do is they destroy supply, which is the opposite of demand, like demand destruction. So demand destruction happens at the consuming end. Supply destruction happens at the producing end, so that what they can do, and it happens a lot if there's a price crisis. So if there's so much, and this will happen in a couple of years, if we're seeing it now with avocados. Let's take avocados for a great example, right? Here in Australia, we have so many avocados that they're now $1 an avocado, which is unheard of compared to what we used to pay for avocados, which was $4 and $5 an avocado.
Yeah, I remember those days.
Remember those days? That's why avocado toast was so expensive. But what happened back then was there wasn't a lot of avocado trees. There wasn't a lot of people producing avocados. So what you had was really expensive avocados because there was a constrained supply. Now what you've got is, because back then producers turned around and said, $5 an avocado, fuck this, I'm getting into the avocado game. Screw my oranges, I want to get into avocados. So they planted avocado trees, and it's 6 years for an avocado tree to fruit.
Long-term investment, isn't it?
Except when everyone's doing the same fucking thing.
Yeah.
And the market gets flooded. And so now what happens, in order to get avocados back to at least some kind of a price where it makes it worth it for producers to farm avocados, they've got to destroy the supply. So they withhold it either by destroying it, keeping it on the trees and refertilizing their ground with it, whatever it takes. They have to constrain the supply to the market. So you're seeing this kind of thing happen with a lot of commodities. Some commodities, like avocados, you can do that with, like coffee, you can do that with. But for example, with crude oil, the reason you can't do that is because once you shut these wells off, you can't turn them back on again. It's too expensive to turn them back on again.
Right.
And so all of these things play a really big role in what we're experiencing in today's industry.
Huge.
The bigger player for us right now is understanding what role climate change is going to play in the ability of the producer to create
just to
coffee.
add that into the mix.
To add that into the mix. And then you add the war in Ukraine because they have so many inputs. You know, they sell, I think it's 60 or 70% of the world's fertilizer comes from Ukraine.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until just the other day.
Yeah, it's huge.
I mean, if we're talking fertilizer that goes into a producing nation, it hampers, I guess, our flowering period, which then hampers the amount of cherries that are formed, which then hampers the production as a whole. But it's such a avalanche effect.
Yeah.
But I mean, all of these, it's not just coffee itself. I mean, we're talking wheat, barley, corn. All of these things are affected, and it's just the beginning.
And a lot of these commodities are things that we use to create all the things that are in our cafes.
Yeah.
The flow-on effect, and this, as we were saying, this bullwhip effect that could end up leading to a drop in price of everything will be very interesting to observe if it eventually ends up happening, because who wins then and who loses? So interesting times ahead. We have one more episode to go, and in this episode we are talking about the opportunities ahead, because while we are in very unique times present an opportunity for growth and for innovating and for a whole bunch of really exciting stuff. And that's the stuff that you and I usually have conversations about. So let's talk about that in the next episode.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Todd. Peace, love, and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon, and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.